Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, my name is Norm Friesen, and I'm going to be talking to you today about what is called the pedagogical relation. Now, I'm going to be focusing on asymmetry, but in addition to that, I'll be looking at other characteristics, including in particular the idea of passion in the pedagogical relation. I'm going to begin my presentation by talking about the meaning of the term pedagogy in the phrase pedagogical relation, because it is particularly important. I'm going to talk about the particular characteristics of the pedagogical relation, including its asymmetry and the passion that is entailed in it, by looking at the work of Herman Nohl, who lived from about the end of the 19th century through to 1970 or so. I'm going to be looking at the question of what Nohl's conception of the pedagogical relation means for pedagogy in general, and then I'm going to conclude by focusing on the pedagogical relation today. The fact that it's been experiencing a bit of a renaissance, a rather humble renaissance, but one nonetheless. I'm going to talk about one book in particular, this little volume here, which is by Michael Felten. It talks about education, Unterricht or instruction, as being a matter of relation, and it includes a discussion both of Nohl and of the relevance of the pedagogical relation in the context of John Hattie's findings. I'm going to conclude finally by talking about the fragility of the pedagogical relation and the fact that it really cannot be understood or I believe practiced outside of the framework that's provided by pedagogy. And let me talk to you now about what pedagogy is. I'm going to focus both on ancient and modern understandings of pedagogy and talk to you about how it differs from the way that the word pedagogy is used today in the English language. The idea of pedagogy that I'll be focusing on is one that has developed and been articulated over the last 2,500 years or so in Europe and on the European continent. It has been formulated with particular force and clarity in the German context. However, there are many important and compelling articulations of this notion in French and other languages as well. Now, one of the key things to remember in discussing what pedagogy means in this context is that it does not refer to a technique or an approach to teaching. So when we use a term like constructivist pedagogy or behaviorist pedagogies, we're using pedagogy in a rather different sense than how it is used in this continental pedagogy I'm talking about. Nor is this pedagogy to be understood primarily as a political program for education, a meaning that was initiated in large part by Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. Moreover, pedagogy, in the sense that I'm discussing it here, is not something that happens just in schools or in institutions of education, but it's something that's found in contexts of influence, both intentional and unintentional influence, where one person or group is exercising some sort of influence on another. This means that it can be found in places like everyday life, within the family, in interactions between adults and children, in interactions where adults are teaching other adults, and in many other contexts as well, including young people teaching adults or influencing adults. Often, particularly in traditional terms, the pedagogy and the influence of pedagogy has been understood in terms of the older influencing the younger. So the older would be labeled as the educator, and the younger would be labeled as the educand, or the one receiving education. It conceptualizes its goal, so this tradition of thinking of pedagogy in these ways, conceptualizes its goal in terms of the realization of the person who's being educated in terms of their personality and autonomy. So it wants to see the personality and autonomy of this person being fully realized as possible. Pedagogy in this sense, of course, is not just about learning or about achieving some sort of predetermined outcomes. So in terms of ancient precursors, one obvious one is Plato's allegory of the cave. That's the one depicted here. But before I mention that, it's important to also note that pedagogy comes from the ancient Greek, and it means leading, or in a broad sense, influencing, I guess, a boy who is younger, and leading this boy typically to school. This implies a dyad right from the start, and implies, in other words, a particular type of relation between an adult and a child. Now, in the allegory of the cave, Plato describes, in effect, an intense relational effort to bring those who are in darkness and in chains into the light. So you can see here that there's groups of people and individuals who are trying to influence others and persuade them that what they see in the cave and what they are witnessing in terms of the play of shadows in the cave is not reality, but rather that reality can be accessed only by climbing a steep incline and a rocky ascent that leads from the cave out into the blinding sunlight and freedom. This can be understood as kind of laying out a paradigm for how pedagogy is understood and how it was discussed, particularly in the early modern period. Another important voice in articulating what pedagogy is Friedrich Schleiermacher. And here I'm focusing specifically on his lectures from 1826. Schleiermacher, in these lectures, and particularly in the introductory lecture, begins by asking a question. He asks, what does the older generation actually want of the younger? And Schleiermacher tries to answer the question by saying, this relationship between the older and the younger, and the obligations of the one to the other, form the basis on which we will build everything that lies in the scope of our theory. And in his lectures, he develops this theory quite extensively, precisely from this basis, the basis of this question. Now, this book and lecture by Schleiermacher is one of a couple of texts that I will be coming out soon with as a part of a book series that I edit with my colleague in Glasgow, Karsten Kenkleys. This book series is called Pedagogical, and it focuses precisely on this idea of pedagogy that has developed on the European continent since the ancient Greeks, and that is also remains relevant there today. So the volume that I'll be taking a lot of my quotes from, particularly when it comes to Nohl, is the one on the right here that's called Tact and the Pedagogical Relation Introductory Readings. I've edited and translated this volume, and it provides a number of texts by Nohl as well as by a range of others in articulating what pedagogical tact and what the pedagogical relation have meant and might be understood to mean today. So the next question is, what exactly is the pedagogical relation? What are its characteristics according to Herman Nohl? So Herman Nohl was the first person who articulated or defined the phrase pedagogical relation. Now, he begins by defining the pedagogical relation specifically in terms of a kind of a traditional pedagogy. He says that the original pedagogy is the pedagogy of parents and teachers, where the goals are first set by the educators and the purposes they represent. And the means of enforcing these goals are those of coercion and, above all, law and punishment. So, although it might sound like Nohl here is actually speaking to or critiquing perhaps Schleiermacher's earlier articulation of this relationship between the older generation and the younger, in which the older generation asks what it wants of the younger, Nohl is actually a very sympathetic reader of Schleiermacher, and indeed understood Schleiermacher as being particularly relevant to educational discussions at a time when very few were actually aware of what Schleiermacher had said about education. In addition, what Schleiermacher is asking about when he says, what does the older generation want of the younger? He's actually saying, well, should we begin with our own purposes, or should we indeed, or implying at least, should we begin with our own purposes, or should we conceive of those as of the younger generation as more important than our own? And if that is the case, how would we divine these purposes, particularly with the youngest of children? Now, Nohl is writing at a time when John Dewey, for example, was formulating some of his key contributions, and also at a time where there was a great deal of awareness of the potential and of a kind of educational reform that was occurring, that was international in nature. And Nohl then is talking about a new pedagogy here. He says, all progress in pedagogy lies in the realization that the pupil has their own priority, and that pedagogical work is conditioned by consideration of them. Thus, step by step, a new pedagogy emerges, one which is built up from the point of view of the young person, or of youth. And so Nohl here is talking about an approach to pedagogy which is what he sees as, or what he characterizes as, an inversion of the traditional pedagogy, in which the purposes and the needs and the wants of young people are more important than those of the older generation. Now, at this time, though, in 1914, Nohl is not really talking explicitly about the pedagogical relation, but you can see the notion beginning to develop, and Nohl essentially remains consistent with this idea of an inversion as defining the pedagogical relation in its essence. Now, in 1926, Herman Nohl actually speaks specifically of the pedagogical relation as such. And it's very interesting that he defines it in terms of the basic stance of the educator. He says this basic stance, this disposition, this attitude is decisively characterized by the fact that its perspective is unconditionally that of the child or student. This means that the task of this pedagogy and of this stance is not to draw the child towards specific, predetermined, objective goals of the state, of the church, of the legal system, of the economy. Instead, it sees its goal in the subject and his or her physical and personal unfolding. That this child here, in their uniqueness, comes to his life's purpose, that is this pedagogy's autonomous and inalienable task. So there's a number of interesting things in this particular definition or articulation of the pedagogical relation. One of them, of course, is that the pedagogical relation is seen actually as protecting the child or young person, not just as directing them. And Nohl mentions the state, the church, the law, and economic imperatives as being some of the things that the child, the young person, needs to be protected against. In this sense, he can be understood as outlining the pedagogical relation as part of a kind of project of negative education. In other words, instead of trying to explicitly direct and influence the child, the point is in some ways to shield the child and the young person from influence, particularly unwanted influence. Another thing that's really important here is the focus on the individual child. So the point here is not that there are things like best practices that are best for children's psychology or children's learning overall, but rather that pedagogical practice is defined as something that is directed always to the unique, the singular, the one and only. And that counts both for how the child is understood and how the situation in which pedagogy unfolds is understood. These things are always, can never be reduced to general laws or principles, but rather are always a question of engaging with uniqueness, with the other precisely in their otherness. Now, in 1933, we read a more conservative Nohl here talking about the pedagogical relation in a slightly different context. In the 1926 definition, he's writing in a text talking about delinquent youth and how they need to be treated according to the new pedagogy. Now in 1933, Nohl is talking more about traditional schooling and also about generally he has in mind younger children. So, and here he comes up with the definition of the pedagogical relation precisely as a passionate relation. The basis of education, he says, is the passionate relation between a mature person on the one hand and one who is becoming on the other, specifically for the sake of the one who is becoming, so that they come to their life and form. So again, he's retaining the emphasis on the fact that the pedagogical relation is for the sake of the young person, for the sake of the person being influenced, rather than for the sake of the educator or the one doing the influencing. And one of the key characteristics that he points out, particularly in terms of the question of passion, is that the pedagogical relationship or relation has its foundation in love. Nohl suggests that the pedagogical relation is passionate, primarily in the sense that it is loving. He says, this love is an educating, bearing, and organizing kind of love, a love that aims not at prolonging the child's obedience, but shortening it. So this is a kind of love, of course, which then sees the purposes and the growth and the realization of the child in their individuality as paramount. Nohl also points out that the pedagogical relation is explicitly asymmetrical. He says, or he indicates, that the pedagogical relation is not for the mutual benefit of those involved. For example, in a friendship where there might be some expectation of mutuality and balance between the benefit and the sacrifice that either might make in the context of that relationship. But for Nohl, the pedagogical relation, as I've already indicated, is there for the sake of the one who is becoming. So the teacher, the educator, the parent are there for the child in a way that the child simply is not there for the parent, for the teacher, for the one who might be seeking to influence them. The pedagogical relation also implies a particular kind of temporality. Here Nohl describes this by saying that the relation of the educator to the child is always doubly determined. It is determined on the one hand by the love for the child as he is, and by the love for his educational goal, the child's ideal. So one of the things about pedagogy, both as it is theorized but also as it is experienced, is that it is always oriented to the future. It's a preparation, of course, in some ways for the future. It is a question of hope for the child. But at the same time, this future orientation exists in constant tension with the fact that the child or the young person tends to be oriented towards the present. And this then gives rise to a certain type of tension in which, as Schleiermacher said, the question becomes one of justifying the sacrifice of the child's present, the place where the child sees their wants and needs as being met, in tension with the orientation towards the future that education constantly implies. The experience of this tension is expressed through phrases like, "Someday you'll thank me," or "no pain, no gain," right? The pain happens now and the gain happens in the future. This is an intrinsic part of the pedagogical experience for the adult and for the child. A further key characteristic is the idea that the pedagogical relation is defined by tact. Now this defines not the temporality of the pedagogical relation, but rather in some ways the spatiality of this relation as it is experienced and as it is understood in this pedagogical theory. Nohl, for his part, says that the peculiar opposition and entwinement of two directions of work on the part of the educator, one which is oriented towards the present and another which is oriented towards the future, constitutes the pedagogical stance. So here again, he's talking about a pedagogical disposition, orientation, and it gives the educator a singular distance to his subject as well as to the child or student. In other words, because the educator is constantly balancing present and future, they must also engage with the student and also with what they are teaching with a particular kind of distance and not become too close to either in a way that would limit the potential for the child, the student, the person being influenced to become who they are, essentially. Nohl goes on to say that in its most refined expression, this distance is called pedagogical tact. A final characteristic that Nohl emphasizes of the pedagogical relation, and this again relates to the temporality I was talking about earlier, is that when the future that is being planned and that is being prepared for in the pedagogical relation actually arrives, and the child or the person essentially becomes who they are, becomes autonomous, becomes an individual, then the relationship between the person who's influencing them and the child or the educand changes. Nohl, for his part, says that the pedagogical relation strives to make itself redundant from both sides, from the side of the educator and the educand. This is a characteristic, he emphasizes, that is unique to this relation as opposed to all other human relations. So the fact that the pedagogical relation comes to an end is something that differentiates it and is something I think that is a struggle for educators and parents, particularly when they are asked then or expected to relate to or to see their child, the person who was once an infant in their arms, as now being a grown person who makes their own decisions and makes their own mistakes. So what does this mean for pedagogy? Pedagogy and the pedagogical relation are really inseparable. You can't think of pedagogy without thinking about a particular kind of relation with particular attributes between educator and educand. Nor can you think of the pedagogical relation and its attributes without reference to what pedagogy means in a broader sense and as articulated in the tradition that I described earlier. Pedagogy, just to speak really broadly now for a moment, can be seen to be a way of knowing, an independent discipline, a perspective on life and on relations themselves. And it is one that brings with it its own vocabulary. And let me just give you a couple of examples from some of the major European languages. So there's the term educand, which has fallen into disuse in English, but is still used in terms of, especially like in French and Spanish, in terms of referring to l'élevé or alumno. Zögling would be the German equivalent of that, and is still used today, although certainly less frequently than it was in earlier centuries. Another key term is Bildung, which refers to this becoming, this realization of the child or the educand's autonomy and individuality and personality. Then there's terms like la didactique and the didactic transposition, which refer to particular ways in which the world is adapted for the sake of the child or of the person being educated, precisely for their education. And then there's the idea of negative education, which I articulated earlier, l'éducation négative, as it's known in French, and it was originally articulated by Rousseau in his Émile. Now, there's still representatives of this pedagogy today in Germany and in France. And although they would probably refer to themselves using various terms, not necessarily see themselves as being part of a European tradition in pedagogy, there is a remarkable continuity between their various publications, and particularly in terms of the questions and issues that they see as being pedagogical. So one example is Otto Friedrich Bollnow, This is a book that I translated back in 2017, and it introduces Bolnow as a particularly existentialist thinker of education. And he was a student, actually, of Nohl's and was active in publishing all the way to the end of the 1980s. And I encourage you just to Google his name with the word pedagogy or education, and you'll find some translations, some of them from myself. Another example is Jörg Zöfas. He recently published this book together with Daniel Burkhardt on pedagogical tact, and this is the first monograph on pedagogical tact to appear in the German language for quite some time. Then there are some examples from French language. One of them is a wonderful book called Frankenstein Pedagogy from a guy named Philippe Miriot. And another great example is this book titled Educate with Tact from Éric Piriat. Now, any discussion of Herman Nohl would not be complete without talking about the controversy surrounding him and his reception in Germany since the Second World War. His role in National Socialism, as one recent historian of education remarked, still remains controversial. However, it is an ambivalent role or legacy that Nohl leaves behind. On the one hand, for example, the key points of Nohl's pedagogy, particularly the autonomy of pedagogy and its disconnection from questions of politics, for example, or of the state, contradicted National Socialist propaganda on education. And Nohl himself was forced into retirement during the Nazi era. Now, on the other hand, in the postscript to his pedagogical magnum opus or key work, it's called The Pedagogical Movement in Germany, Nohl says that the creed of his pedagogical movement is one that is secured by the state. So there are indications that he aligned himself, or it is clear that he aligned himself in particular ways with the Nazi state. At the same time, though, these in some ways, or in quite a few ways, are inconsistent with his own thought. So Nohl and the pedagogical relation have since been critiqued and described as superannuated in Germany. So one example is this quote from Klaus Mollenhauer, who is writing in 1968 and saying that educational processes, including those envisioned by Nohl, in his conception of the pedagogical relation as the most basic relation, have not been subject to reflective engagement. This has happened since Mollenhauer wrote this reflective engagement. The realization of such pedagogical propositions, such as those made by Nohl, in combination is at the same time the realization of an image of society. So Mollenhauer here is saying that you cannot think of pedagogy without also thinking of society as a whole. The criteria for pedagogical valuation are at the same time those that belong to a particular understanding of society. Nohl's pedagogical relation has also been criticized above all for the fact that it places a considerable load on the teacher to engage with the child in a way that is simultaneously passionate but also simultaneously controlled, for example, in terms of the distance that is embodied in pedagogical tact. So let me return to the question of the pedagogical relation today. So this is a set of book covers showing you the work of John Hattie. It begins with visible learning, a synthesis of over 800 meta-analyses relating to student achievement. And what Hattie does is in bringing all these studies together, is he tries to identify those factors which have the greatest effect on learning and achievement. And as the quote here suggests, reveals teaching's holy grail, suggests that this is seen as a kind of a silver bullet for what is important in teaching, what needs to be done in the classroom, etc. Now, John Hattie has been translated into German, and one man in particular, Klaus Zierer, has undertaken this translation and has also been a proponent of Hattie's in Germany. my impression is that one hears more about John Hattie in Germany than actually one hears about him here in North America. And this influence is the reason for the pedagogical relation receiving a certain mention and observation, and particularly Nohl's notion of the pedagogical relation, as being remarked on again today in a positive way. So this is a paper by Eva Mattes, who is a professor for pedagogy in Augsburg, and she has written about the pedagogical tradition, including the movement that Nohl is talking about when he talks about the pedagogical movement in Germany. Now, Mattes observes the following: even if the importance of the educator was too highly charged and Nohl did not do justice to individual contexts, the teacher and his or her importance are once again receiving special attention. And this is happening through the results of the Hattie studies, whose German translator Klaus Sierer does not tire of emphasizing that it is precisely the teachers and their passion that matter for the creation of a quality teacher-student, teacher-pupil relationship. And then Mattes observes, here Nohl's terms once again come into play. Now, to return to the text by Michael Felten that I mentioned at the outset, this is a book entirely devoted to the question of relation in education. And Felten does a particularly good job of summarizing a wide range of sources that show the importance of pedagogical relation. He talks about Nohl in particular. He talks also about earlier precursors, and then he focuses on a range of contemporary fields and findings, including empirical ones from psychology, neuroscience, anthropology, and elsewhere, to show that there has been recently accumulating a great deal of evidence that supporting the idea that relation is actually the key aspect of pedagogy. He uses a number of examples from concrete classroom practice as well. Now, Felten is an author who is not a professor, he's a teacher. This book is published, I think, intentionally as a kind of popular press publication. It's very easy to read, very accessible. At the same time, it is very thorough, or reasonably thorough and historical. And it also provides 2 short questionnaires on measuring the quality of, or looking into the quality of relation between teacher and student in particular. Felten also quotes an earlier academic work, this one by Ewald Terhardt, which takes the Hattie studies into consideration and reflects on them critically. But Terhardt as well and Felten indirectly notes the curious convergence of the findings of the Hattie studies of what has the greatest impact on student achievement and learning, and the way Nohl describes the pedagogical relation. This is what Terhardt says: through this active and challenging teacher image, Hattie effectively rehabilitates the dominant verbose teacher, one who also knows when to step back and to remain silent in practice of pedagogical tact. The perspective on teaching is teacher-centered. In the center stands an educator, one for whom the learners in turn are at the center, but the teacher is the person who provides that kind of organizing and supporting center for this concern and for the students or the children. The teacher must be able to see their learning in order to orient her teaching around it. That's what Terhardt says is Hattie's effective point. So it's possible to see how the pedagogical relation outlined by Nohl has a number of characteristics and whose salience have been made clear for us today precisely through the kind of empirical studies and meta-analyses that an author like Hattie has undertaken. Now, any discussion of the pedagogical relation in the context of pedagogy needs to emphasize the fact that it's fragile. Nohl certainly describes it this way, and one can certainly say that if a relation ceases to aim at the realization of the personality and autonomy of the one being educated, it ceases to be an end in if it ceases to be an end in itself, then this pedagogical relation disappears. As a result, if this relation begins to be, or is conceived in instrumental terms, it becomes inauthentic, manipulative. It gains instrumental qualities, and I think that one could even say that it gains a particular type of lived space, time, and also a different type of terminology would apply to it. This would be the terminology that we use today, of terminology of learners, i.e. those whose function is to learn. Narrowing it even further, talking about the learner's brain and how it can be activated, affected, and manipulated without thinking about the fact that it is inevitably part of a person. The whole question of learning and its facilitation can be seen as allied with with an approach that would make the pedagogical relation effectively irrelevant. Of course, the asymmetry of the relation would disappear as well. Felton brings this home, I think, in a nice way. He is talking about how the fact that the pedagogical relation needs to be asymmetrical, and that the language that we use today of, the teacher, for example, facilitating learning and being kind of a co-creator or co-constructor of knowledge with the child is actually dangerous and false. Felton says the pedagogical relationship is meaningfully and inescapably asymmetrical. It's related to knowledge and mediation. It is intergenerational and institutional. Again, one could extend this by saying it appeals to the obligation and responsibility of the adult or of the educator in the pedagogical situation. To deny this, Felton emphasizes, would be simply educational malpractice. So I want to thank you for your attention, point you to some further reading, and encourage you to be in touch with me. The further reading that I'd point you to of texts that are currently available now dealing with this notion of the pedagogical relation in the pedagogical tradition are both available from the Journal of Curriculum Studies. One is called The Pedagogical Relation, Past and Present, and the second one is called Education as a Geisteswissenschaft, as a humanities discipline. So please feel free to check out my publications on academia.edu. I look forward to discussion.